Yeah, thank you for coming. It's not a great day out, so I appreciate everyone showing up for this thing. Initially, when we were thinking about this, we were talking about what could we sort of share with the greater community as a software company, and generally things like automation and just the general nature in which things are becoming more procedural becomes something that gets used a lot or talked about a lot. And there's a bit of a fear and loathing based around how this affects sort of the other portion of what we do, which is to try and enable artists to build great products or great images with the software that we make. So largely, when people think of automation, they're thinking about these procedural robots that build things, and they do a lot of really wondrous things, but it's usually in a very serial way. They generally have no idea of the things that are sort of around them. So they're very fascinating, but they're also very dumb. And there's been a lot of change afoot, and there's a lot of innovation that's been happening in this area. And people still think of it as a very largely mechanistic way of being. So we start to see a little bit more exciting work being done in sort of on the fringes. MIT have created sort of this multiple robot that works basically through this way of being not necessarily tethered to a particular base, but largely very frequent, very fluent, and very able to sort of navigate things in space, make decisions on its own. And we see this as being sort of the beginning point by which we start to gauge this idea of automation. And it becomes very interesting because essentially you can see sort of humanistic elements that are being drawn into this conversation, but still it's not necessarily about decision making, it's more about sort of locomotion, trying to get from point A to point B in a more efficient way using some of the principles that have been learned through nature. So when we talk about creative automation, what exactly are we talking about? Now, there's obviously been, throughout the whole course of creativity and in the artistic community, ways by which people have tried to facilitate this idea of making things more automated. So everybody from, say, Rubens, a long time ago, through to Warhol, through to Damien Hirst, who have a large installation in the West Country. There's been always sort of these attempts to try and figure out, is there a way that we can take sort of the manufacturing aesthetic and bring it into sort of more sort of creative work? So, but largely what we find is that people start to think of this, when they start to think of this, they think of it more as a sort of automated process of a largely mechanical function. So we're only replicating sort of the execution portion of what people are doing, not necessarily sort of the cognitive skills. Unfortunately, this video doesn't seem to be playing, but effectively it's just a large articulated arm that writes out sort of cursive script. But I think one of the more interesting elements, okay, it's starting to work now, is when we start going into the idea of sort of machine learning or machine vision. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to elicit this idea from from computers, an ability to do something that we take for granted, which is to recognize things and to identify them. This was an image that was created by Google not too long ago, where they basically took their virtualized neural network and asked them to recognize particular objects, in this case animals, but also then feed them back into this redrawing that creates this sort of feedback loop, and what you get is this oddly sort of hallucinogenic imagery that creates this very interesting form or interesting vision of something that doesn't quite exist, but it surely is based around some strong principles. And then we've all heard of the idea of sort of generated text, where we basically use sort of small streams, in this case Markov chains, to try and create this nature of new naturalistic dialogue. Language is very much something that doesn't seem to fall very nicely into the constraints of sort of a machine sort of learning process, but if you create a sort of a probabilistic model, you can actually start to create things that sound relatively natural. And one of the attempts here was to try and create legitimate wine reviews based around the kind of vagaries of the wine language that sound realistic to a potential reader. And of course, generated music is something that's been with us for a little bit of time now. I think it's fairly fairly understood what the principles are there. But essentially here, all we're doing is we're trying to simulate something that exists before. We're not trying to build or break new ground. Maybe one of the more interesting sort of versions of this is trying to use principles of analytics to create new forms. And essentially all we're doing here, this is a piece done by an artist, Andy Lomas, who formerly worked for the Foundry. It's really just creating a series of principles and then letting the machine run through the different sort of variations and the different sort of iterations of this. And you can find that what I find very interesting about pieces like this is that how quickly you start to see the analogous to sort of natural or evolutionary forms, because essentially all it's doing is trying to reduce it to the most natural set of options. And people look at this and find it either soothing or a bit sort of disturbing, specifically because while it's just a series of algorithms, it automatically invokes some sort of naturalistic response, which was, of course, the nature of this piece. And you can use then this to then maybe take it to try and explore forms that you might not necessarily have been able to do sort of from pure natural or human intuition. Another example of this is sort of more of a growing stream here. So again, just really trying to find the nature through sort of the computed sphere. So what does this actually mean for design? Because it's really interesting to talk about this in an artistic space where it's a sort of a one-off experiment. But what does this mean for the people whose job it is to create for a living? Well, you're starting to see already some sort of modest attempts at automation, when in fact there's a lot of things that fall within the creative sphere that aren't actually really that creative. They're just more sort of iterations or playing outs of various sort of design structures. So here's an attempt by Squarespace to try and reduce the nature of complexity in graphic design. It's arguable whether or not they were able to successfully succeed in this, but interestingly enough, they are trying to create principles or trying to follow through from principles to create sort of design structures so that people who may not necessarily feel that they were emancipated or part of the design process can now largely be create design structure. We also have sort of, again along the same lines as the Andy Lomas piece, sort of a more programmatic way of making pattern discovery. This is a site by Netan that basically allows you to create generative patterns that you can then use for them to then create 3D printed, or in this case 3D knitted versions of scarves and sweaters. And obviously, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to know that if you can start to create this sort of generative design principle, then you can then easily apply it to structural forms. In this case, a Gaudi chair, which basically uses some of the branching properties of plants in order to create a structural basis. And so a lot of this is being created based on sort of preset conditions that have been put in and then modified slightly based on user output. Lastly, I'd like to kind of call attention to something that's probably automation that probably doesn't seem that way, which is more the idea of being able to search. Google, not surprisingly, has been on the forefront of image-based searching, but there are now interesting other startups that are building around this idea of computer vision and looking at creating relationships based around sort of structures that you've put in place. So you upload an image, it tries to see or read the image and then find things that are associated with it. And we're now seeing sort of a cottage industry of products that are built around this idea of computer viewing, computer seeing. And I'd be greatly remiss if I didn't actually mention some of the things we were doing at the Foundry in this space that largely take that idea and try and use it to facilitate that idea of exploration and creation and curation of inspirational sources. So it's not necessarily a case of being able to say that automation is supplanting the role of people or of designers in the process, but there are ways in which it can sort of help sort of create relationships prior, which may not necessarily have been there prior, in order to create sort of interesting and naturalistic structures. So that's kind of my sort of whistle-stop tour of things creative in the automation space. But I'd like to basically use that as an opportunity to try and kind of set the scene, if you will, for what's to come next. Thank you.